The unfairest matches in the history of the Colosseum, battles so absurd you'd think Rome was running a parody fight club. Let's dive right into it.
Let's start with the unfair and slowly work our way towards the most brutal matchups on the list. Number 10. Blind fighters. Andebadia were criminals who would be forced to fight completely blind. They would be given a straight sword and a helmet for protection. Except the helmet was practically a curse, since it was completely sealed off, preventing the fighter from seeing or hearing anything. The fight would begin as soon as the fighters were placed within close range of one another, with the most popular strategy being the swing and pray method, which in all honesty, was the only strategy available. Now, the good news is that judges weren't really needed for these fights, since the winners were very easy to identify, as they were the only contestants still breathing. Now, the crazy part is that this spectacle was seen as comedic relief more than anything, and if you don't think two blind men fighting each other to the death is hilarious, well, you have a lot to learn about comedy. Now, this might not sound that unfair at first, since both men are equally blind and equipped with the same weapon. But think again, since the winner of the match would typically be rewarded with another match, then another one, and another one, and another one. You get the point. As you can imagine, a winning streak never really lasted for very long.
So the prize for surviving blindfolded murder twister was doing it again? That's less a reward and more a DLC pack for misery. Romans basically invented the world's worst video game, zero graphics, no audio, and permadeath. Swing and pray combat sounds less like strategy and more like bad Wi-Fi sword fighting.
Number 9. Naval battles. There was nothing more epic than the naval battles of the Colosseum. Also, one of the most unfair, bloody, and expensive. The event would begin by filling the Colosseum with water in around a dozen ships. It's estimated that thousands of prisoners would participate in these events. But let's talk about what made these battles unfair. Now, depending on the starting position of your ship, it could determine your likelihood of survival. Well, at least for a bit longer, as the odds of survival were almost non-existent to begin with. Ships that started in between two other ships would make for an easy target, easily creating a 1v2 scenario. Prisoners would invade other ships, killing everyone that stood in their way, while others would simply use the more popular strategy we see today, which is of course, running away from all fights and sneaking their way to the final round, where they can hope to steal the win with a single kill. The bloody fight would come to an end when there was only one ship or team remaining. As terrible as these battles were, at least they were easy to clean up. The Romans would try their best to remove all the large debris from the water, before the stadium would be flushed like a giant toilet bowl, sending all the remains downstream for another town to deal with.
So Rome basically turned the Colosseum into the world's deadliest pool party. 1,000-man Fortnite, but on boats, with zero respawns, and the cleanup crew just pull the drain plug and let some unlucky downstream village deal with your floating corpse buffet. Peak Roman efficiency, bloody spectacle plus plumbing innovation.
Number 8. Gladiator fights. Gladiator fights were the single most popular matches of the Colosseum, with the good matchups typically being saved for the main event. Now, how can two gladiators fighting each other be unfair, you might ask? Well, for starters, the emperors weren't really interested in fairness, as their primary concern was entertainment. And with over 20 different classes of gladiators to choose from, the styles would be mixed and matched based on entertainment alone. Here are some of the most unfair and popular matchups. Retiarius versus Secutor. Retiarius were equipped with a net, a trident, a dagger, and minimal armor, while the Secutor was equipped with a sword, a large shield, a helmet, and heavy armor. Go ahead, pick one. If you chose the Secutor, well, GG's, you're dead, as the Retiarius just had to keep his distance and poke at the Secutor. Or better yet, trap him by throwing his net on him, giving him enough time to emote before poking him to death. Alright, let's try another one. Murmillo versus Thorax. Murmillo were armed with a large rectangular shield, a short sword, a helmet, and a metal or leather sleeve for protection, while the Thorax was equipped with a light shield, a curved sword, a helmet, and a metal or leather sleeve for protection. Go ahead, pick one. If you chose the Murmillo, rip, you're dead, as the Thorax just had to tire out the Murmillo since he was carrying the heavier shield. As you can see, stylistic matchups were a big deal and could easily influence the outcome of a fight. And I know this might come as a shock to some, but not all gladiator fights were to the death. A lot of fights would be called off when a fighter took heavy damage, since good gladiators were very expensive to replace.
That's actually crazy. So the Romans basically built a live-action rock, paper, scissors, except the loser bleeds out in front of 50,000 people. One guy's stuck in heavy armor, the other's spamming range attacks like an annoying PvP camper. And sometimes matches just stopped early because, hey, fighters were pricey collectibles, not disposable NPCs.
Number 7. Animal battles. Humans were not the only ones to have unfair matchups inside of the Colosseum, since animals were also treated like criminals. They would be enslaved, pinned against each other, and humiliated, and were such a popular spectacle that at times, thousands of animals would be slaughtered in a given day, which was completely unsustainable, driving many animals to extinction. Here are some of the most popular and unfair matchups that were commonly seen in the Colosseum. Elephant versus rhino. One of the most famous Colosseum battles was when an enraged rhino was pinned against an elephant, with the elephant eventually winning when he decided to cheat by grabbing a spear with its trunk and gouging the rhino's eyes out. Lion versus tiger. This matchup is basically a robbery, as I'm sure the locals would have bet large amounts of money against the guys from out of town, since they knew that the lion always wins, with there only being one recorded incident of a tiger getting the best of a lion. Elephant versus bull. As you can imagine, when an animal has over 10,000 pounds on its opponent, it's not really going to be much of a fight, is it? But just to make matters worse, sometimes the elephant and the bull would be chained together, forcing the action. And no matter how the fight begins, it would always end with the bull being turned to soup. Really quickly, here are some of the other animal fights that were very popular. Rhino versus bear, rhino versus buffalo, rhino versus elephant, crocodile versus hippo, tiger versus bear, bear versus bull, bear versus wolves, goro versus scorpion, lion versus bull, lion versus bear, lion versus panther, lion versus chimp, lion versus hyenas, lion versus basically any animal the Romans can get a hold of.
So Rome's idea of Saturday entertainment was basically Pokemon battles without Pokeballs or consent. The fair fight label went out the window once elephants started stealing weapons like glitching players. And of course, lions were the house favorites. Locals knew the meta. Honestly, this wasn't sport. It was extinction speedrunning with extra gore DLC.
Number 6. 1 versus 2. This matchup can be unfair for either side depending on the circumstances. Let me explain. There are 2 scenarios in which this matchup can take shape. 1. A high-level gladiator will take on 2 prisoners simultaneously, and as the prisoners try their best to figure out how to properly hold a sword, they will realize that it's very difficult to do so, since their hands are no longer attached. Now, the second scenario is a bit more fair. 3 well-trained gladiators were placed inside of the Colosseum. One gladiator would be given heavy armor and a good weapon, while his 2 opponents would receive minimal armor and worse weapons. The duo would need to work together to defeat the better equipped man. But being partnered up is not as easy as you might think, and does come with its own set of challenges, like knowing whether you should go for the res or attempt to clutch up when your partner inevitably goes down. The last and final way that a gladiator can be outnumbered is during large-scale battles. This one is of course purely based on luck alone, and doesn't always mean that you will see a 1v2 matchup, as it just might be a 1v6 depending on how bad your team is.
So basically the Romans invented co-op mode and immediately made it unplayable. 2 newbies fumbling with swords against a max level tank, yeah, that's less teamwork and more cannon fodder. And in group battles, 1 versus 2 could just as easily glitch into 1 versus 6, because matchmaking was basically done by dice rolls and sadism.
Number 5. Woman versus dwarf. Emperor Domitian introduced the legendary matchup woman versus dwarf. And I have to admit, this is the only battle on the list where a clear winner was not well documented. But even with the little information we do have, I have a gut feeling that it just wasn't a fair matchup. I'm just not certain for whom. You see, on one hand, you have a fully grown woman who obviously has the reach advantage, while on the other hand, you have a male dwarf who is much stronger and obviously uses magic. How much stronger? Well, I'm not sure. I did, however, stumble upon this forum where a guy asked the same question back in 2011. Now, sadly, people just replied back with even more interesting questions that we will never get the answers to. And of course, naturally, the entire forum devolved into guys just bragging about how many dwarves they can take on at once. One of the most bizarre things about this matchup was that Emperor Domitian liked to schedule this fight at night, since he preferred this battle when it was illuminated by torchlights. In 2010, a female gladiator's remains were found in England. After they were examined, it was concluded that the woman's legs and arm bones were unusually heavy, suggesting that she had strong muscles. You know, I was originally leaning towards the dwarf, but now I really don't see how they could possibly win.
That's fucked up. Like, peak, what even is this matchup energy? A full-grown fighter versus someone half their size, scheduled as torch-lit night entertainment. Domitian basically turned the arena into late-night reality TV. And of course, history left us zero clear outcomes, just weird form debates centuries later. Romans really speed-ran absurdity.
Number 4. Wild animal hunts. Perhaps one of the most unique spectacles of the Colosseum was the wild animal hunts. Here, the entire Colosseum arena was made to resemble the animal's natural environment. A few men were then brought out to the arena equipped with small shields and weapons. Then for the next few minutes or hours, the arena would be slowly filled with terrifying predators. But if they really wanted to get the crowd on their feet, all the animals would be released at once. Sometimes the men who were fighting the lions, bears, and panthers would have been well-trained fighters, while other times they would have been condemned criminals who were just given the death sentence and stood zero to no chance of winning. Here are some of the animals you could have expected to make an appearance: lions, tigers, bears, elephants, rhinos, panthers, leopards, hyenas, wolves, boars, bulls, deers, ostriches, crocodiles, giraffes, camels, and shiprats. Of course, shiprats were not invited, but they showed up anyways.
So imagine Fortnite, but the map just keeps spawning lions, rhinos, and the occasional giraffe. Sometimes you're a trained fighter, sometimes you're just cannon fodder with a stick. And the crowd? Losing their minds as wave after wave of wildlife pours in. Honestly, it's less a hunt and more Jurassic Park speedrun chaos.
Number 3. Man vs. Beast. Man vs. Beast matches were one-on-one battles and were the second most popular spectacle, only behind gladiator fights. Now, there were basically two ways that this matchup would be arranged, with both of them tailored for maximum entertainment for the crowd. The first one was when a professional slave or volunteer fighter known as a bestiarius would face off with a terrifying beast. The animal could be anything from a lion, leopard, tiger, bear, or any other large and powerful creature. These battles would typically end with the animal being defeated, even if the bestiarius took heavy damage. On the other hand, the second matchup was much more bloody and typically ended with the man being torn to pieces. Here, a criminal or prisoner of war would be forced to face off with the animal. With little to no training, it was only a matter of time before the man would become an anatomy lesson. And it definitely didn't help that the animals were starved for long periods of time before they were brought out, making them a lot more angry and aggressive. There was even a single lion that took out over 200 men before it was finally defeated, which is obviously a padded record, since it clearly fought nothing but tomato cans. Oh, I should also mention there is another event that was very popular and is somewhat related, where a criminal was tied to a stake and then a wild animal would be released to eat him alive. You know, you would think that this would be one of those situations where if you've seen it once, then you've seen them all type of deal. But apparently, some emperors love to show this one quite often.
That's so random. So basically, gladiator Pokemon battles, but with the difficulty slider cranked to unfair. Sometimes you had trained fighters barely scraping by. Other times it was just some poor guy respawning as Lion Chow. And that one lion with 200 wins? Total stat padding. Imagine bragging about your kill streak when half your opponents didn't even spawn with gear.
Number 2. Prisoner versus professional gladiator. Easily one of the most unfair matchups of the Colosseum was when prisoners would face off against a professional and seasoned gladiator. The professional gladiator could have been a slave himself with many fights under his belt, or a volunteer gladiator that was part of one of the many gladiatorial schools. Either way, the criminal with zero to no experience was basically sentenced to death. You see, what could be worse than being invaded, enslaved, and kept inside of a cell for days, just to be given a weapon you have never used, then pushed to the center of the Colosseum floor, only for Spartacus to make his walkout shortly after you.
This is like matchmaking a bronze rookie against the final boss. Weapon you've never held, crowd screaming, and then Mr. 100 fights entrenched walks in. It's not a duel, it's target practice with a human piñata. Honestly, calling it sport is generous. It's just Rome live streaming public executions with extra flair.
Number 1. Rigged fights. What could be more unfair than rigged matches? Emperor Commodus was definitely the worst offender when it came to rigged matches. The emperor ruled Rome from 180 to 192 AD and was even portrayed by Joaquin Phoenix in the 2000 film Gladiator. Commodus was obsessed with becoming a famous and well-respected gladiator, so much so that he would even compete himself. Well, if you could even call it that. An emperor fighting as a gladiator was unheard of. Now, of course, Commodus had the best training in all of Rome and was actually very talented with the sword. But that wouldn't stop him from rigging fights by secretly injuring men just moments before they were brought out to face him. His opponents were injured in a way that could be concealed under their armor, but be devastating enough to hinder their performance or make a limb unusable. Another strategy that the emperor would use was simply fighting men with zero to no experience, making for another easy W. Emperor Commodus would have the longest undefeated record as a gladiator, and it's suspected that he competed hundreds of times. He would also charge the Roman treasury around 25,000 pieces of silver every time he competed. There are many things you could call Emperor Commodus, but one thing you can't say is that he ever discriminated, since animals were also injured and thrown in to face him. Apparently, he killed hundreds of lions, ostriches, some giraffes, and on one occasion even killed 3 elephants that were just laying on the floor. Now, as horrible as this all sounds, this was all just a warm-up, and in November of 192 AD, he held the Polybian Games, a festival that lasted around 2 weeks. There, Commodus shot hundreds of animals with arrows and javelins every single day. But if it makes you feel any better, 1 month after the Polybian Games, Commodus would be strangled to death inside of his bathtub by a professional wrestler named Narcissus. Which, for a man, that has to be the most embarrassing way to be found dead. Completely naked inside of a cold tub. You can't even explain your way out of that one.
Commodus basically speedran being the world's first pay-to-win gladiator. Rigged fights, injured enemies, even farming XP off half-dead giraffes. Dude milked Rome's treasury like it was his Twitch donation jar, only to end up strangled in his bathtub by a wrestler. Imagine explaining that death screen. Peak Roman irony. Good Enough did an amazing job with this video. The link's in the description. And next time, let's just say things get even stranger. Stay nerdy.